We negate the resolution that on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. We define economic sanctions in accordance with the Council on Foreign Relations definition, which is the withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations on foreign and security policy purposes. We define Western interests as impacts that benefit the economy, military strength, energy independence, and well-being of the United States, EU, and associated allies. For framework, the pro must prove a net reduction in the threat Russia poses to Western interests, otherwise unigate. Our first contention is that sanctions increase the Russian nuclear threat. Before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. imposed sanctions on oil shipments to Japan to punish its aggression on the Asian mainland, drastically underestimating how Japan would respond with war. Today, Western countries are making the same mistake with Russia. An analysis by Graham Addison, director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, proves ways in which sanctions escalate the threat of war. First, the damage that sanctions inflict on the Russian economy force Putin closer to military action because the Russian hyper-nationalist political base wants Russia to resist, not capitulate to sanctions. 2, Sam Wilkin writes for Reuters that as a result of the sanctions on Iran, 9 tons of Iran's enriched uranium were shipped to Russia, increasing Russia's nuclear stockpile. 3, sanctions that Russia placed on Turkey have escalated, not quieted tensions between the two countries, according to Lin from the Asian Times. As a result, a leading Russian military analyst claims that nuclear war is very likely. Allison concludes that if the sanctions are continued past July 2016 when they're set to expire, Putin will likely respond by ending all cooperation with the West and further militarize, which it has already started to do. Stephen Blake reports that after sanctions were enacted, Russia deployed nuclear weapons to Crimea, which a former Russian military general explains is a signal of its willingness to go to nuclear war. Russia's 2014 military doctrine emphasizes that Russia will use nuclear weapons not only in response to nuclear attacks, but also, quote, in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation. Sertrioni reports in November 2015 that Russia is building new nuclear missiles, bombs, and submarines to replace technology from the 1980s. CAC 15 reports that Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons as a tool to protect Russian interests in the Ukraine crisis. The impact to nuclear wars is complete annihilation. Russia has a nuclear arsenal capable of literally erasing the United States from the map, and many Western countries as well. This is the most important argument in this debate because it's the greatest threat to the West. President John F. Kennedy once said, above all, while we defend our vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations, which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. This is exactly the course that economic sanctions are forcing on Russia today. Our second contention is China. According to an article by RFE, Russia and China have already agreed on the parameters of joint funding for the construction of a high-speed route, an investment that will exceed 1 trillion rubles. Struman writes for the New York Times that at the highest levels, Beijing and Moscow haven't been friendlier in decades. Both sides are promising to expand both trade and investment. Putin has for several years been turning to China, a shift that became even more imperative after low oil prices and Western sanctions. President Xi Jinping has been a willing partner. Beijing sees Russia as a potential gold mine of raw materials, infrastructure products, and new customers for its spreading factories. So what threat does this pose on Western interests? The Nuclear Threat Initiative reports that China has operational nuclear weapons. According to a document by John Richardson, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, Russia and China command a growing arsenal of high-end war-fighting capabilities. He goes on to say that the Russian Navy is operating with a frequency and in areas not seen for almost 2 decades, and the Chinese plane is extending its reach around the world. This is extremely pertinent because this evaluation was released just 4 days ago. It is a threat that is taking place right now, which sanctions have failed to reduce. So our two contentions have 3 main impacts. First, sanctions have resulted in Russia receiving more nuclear weapons from Iran, which makes Russia more powerful. 2, Russia has become more aggressive since sanctions, making it more likely and more willing to go to nuclear war. And 3, spurred by sanctions, Russia's economic and potential military alliance with China is a significant threat to the Western world. And for these reasons, we urge a negative ballot.
Before my partner gives her speech, can I offer some cards?
Sure.
I see the Ukrainian willingness, how it proves that Russia's willing to go to nuclear war. I think that's contention.
Yeah.
And then as well as the report from 4 days ago.
Yeah.
I just want to say, since it looks like none of the notes are timing, make sure you're cross-timing each other. Each other honestly. At this point, you should be doing that anyways, but yeah.
So wait, just to be clear, you wanted the first link, which is the Ukraine link, to give the reference, right?
I believe that you said proves that they're willing to go to nuclear war.
Yeah, that was the, okay.
So this is going to be the Richardson document.
The date is April 2015, April 20th.
How much prep was that?
I'll do a minute.
Is everyone ready? We affirm the resolution resolved on balance economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. Threat is defined as the possibility that something bad or harmful could happen by Merriam-Webster. According to the U.S. Department of State in December 2014, the national priority is to encourage and assist our allies to reduce Russian leverage over Western Europe. Thus, we defend the position that it is in the West's utmost interest to maintain greater influence in Europe and prevent this power from falling to Russia. Contention 1, sanctions are a preventative measure. It is important to remember that one of the key goals of sanctions is to constrain countries from pursuing further actions. Dre and Popescu write for the European Union Institute in 2014 that sanctions made Russia seriously factor in possible Western responses to its actions in Ukraine, which seems not to have been the case prior to the annexation of Crimea. They cite several specific examples, such as keeping Russia from seizing even more territory, not taking the coastal city of Mariupol, and no attempt to forge a corridor from mainland Russia to Crimea. They conclude that sanctions minimize the risk that Russia will seek to openly destabilize other parts of Ukraine or neighboring nations. According to Oleg Buklemishev of the Carnegie Endowment in 2015, the ceasefires and agreements negotiated in Minsk were largely the result of sanctions. In the light of all this, it is no longer correct to say that sanctions have had no effect. Contention 2 is energy independence. Sanctions promote European energy independence from Russia. According to Mueller of Reval in 2014, Eastern Europe was 90% dependent on Russia for gas and electricity. However, sanctions are beginning to shift the situation. First, the emergence of European motivation for independence has occurred. Mueller furthers that sanctions have pushed Russia to cut energy supplies to Europe, in turn motivating Western nations to achieve energy independence. Youngs of Carnegie Europe in September 2014 reports that actions in Ukraine have caused the European Union to make a political commitment to accelerate progress on energy independence and energy efficiency. Second, sanctions are disrupting the Russian energy monopoly. According to Barnado of CNBC in October 2015, Russia's energy minister announced the cancellation of drilling operations in Russia's Arctic shelf since sanctions against Russia have effectively suspended access to Western oil and gas technology necessary for the project. There are 3 impacts to reduce Russian leverage. First, undermining foreign policy goals. Berghaus of the Democratic Union states that dysfunctional energy politics could undermine fundamental European foreign and security interests worldwide if nations are stuck in dependency on Russia. Secondly, a decreased chance of conflict. Fliss of Boston College in 2008 finds that asymmetrical interdependent relationships increase the chance of conflict among states. By becoming energy independent, asymmetrical energy trade would end, thus decreasing chance of conflict in Western states. And lastly, political power. Kalman of the Strategic Studies Institute in 2014 concludes that Russia can use its energy exports as a political weapon. He furthers, if the EU was less reliant on Russian energy, it could respond to Russian aggression in a more effective manner. Contention 3 is a weaker military. Jason Corcoran in October 2014 writes that more people immigrated from Russia in the first 8 months of 2014, over 200,000 people, than in any full year under Putin's rule. With the stigma of sanctions limiting access to capital markets abroad and the government tightening controls at home, more entrepreneurs and investors in particular are looking elsewhere. Thomas Barnick in August 2015 writes, the capacity of Russian military industry could be further limited by intensified ranging from the country. Unlike in the 1990s, when mostly the unskilled and poor escaped Russia, now educated specialists and experts lead the exodus. Such a reality is slowly creating a significant problem for Russian industry. Additionally, according to Franz Stefan of the Diplomat in 2015, the Russian military budget is set to increase at its lowest rate since 2011. Usually, Russia increases its military budget by 5 to 10%, but in 2016, it is only set to increase its budget by 0.8%. The economic sanctions are clearly having an effect on weakening Russia's military, which is beneficial for Western interests, and for all these reasons we affirm.
Can I see the card that sanctions have caused Europe to make a serious commitment to energy independence, please? We're not typing, we'll just start talking here. We'll crossfire, yeah. I just need to see it.
in your first contention, you talk about preventative measures, right?
Right.
So if Russia actually wanted a ceasefire, why did they send 20,000 more troops into Ukraine just last month?
Okay, so while they may have sent in troops, these troops aren't actually doing anything, right? And we see with the Minsk agreement that violence has actually decreased and Russian aggression is
Then what
being
threat
reduced.
is this contention actually impacting?
So we're basically showing you that economic sanctions have been successful in reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests by decreasing
But
conflict.
how is
Okay, can I have a
sending
question?
20,000 troops
Can I have a
not a
question?
threat? How is that not an aggressive measure?
Well, right now they're not doing anything, and we see from the Minsk agreement that was passed because of economic sanctions that violence is actually decreasing. So can I have a question now?
Sure.
So in your first contention, it's all about nuclear technology, right?
Mhm.
So and your impact is that nuclear war is more likely, and Russia's actually considering a full-out nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
How does this actually like a logical conclusion to make? Like, why would Russia actually
If
be
we
willing
can
to?
see in the status
waste
quo,
nuclear?
Russia is already threatening and willing to go to nuclear war.
How are they threatening us
We
right
provide
now?
three links. So first, the hyper-nationalist political base, saying that because of Russia's
Right.
advisors in the elite,
Okay.
they're forcing Putin to not capitulate to sanctions, but rather resist. The second link is that Iran's enriched uranium, that's increasing Russia's nuclear stockpile, making them a bigger threat. And three, sanctions placed on Turkey have escalated, which
But
is
just
just irrelevant
because-
evidence, saying that Russian aggression has increased and it hasn't been reduced at all from sanctions. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, in your energy independence contention, why is energy independence a prerequisite to green energy? So why does sanctions need to happen, and why does Europe need to move away in order to have renewable energy?
Okay, so right now what we're seeing is that sanctions have motivated Europe to become energy independent. Because right now Russia supplies a lot of gas and electricity to
But
Europe.
hasn't-
But right now, because of sanctions, they're not as effective as they can be because of European dependence.
Hasn't
So
the
right now they're
whole
looking
world
to become
been more
independent.
motivated for green energy? I mean, we
Right,
all
we're showing
know
you
that
the
climate
picture.
change is going to affect all of us, so isn't it in their best interest anyways
Right, so
to move towards greener energy? So I don't see how that's unique at all.
well, we're showing you the uniqueness right here. Sanctions have caused Europe to look to become more energy independent. It's actually motivating them more
Well, how
right
can you
now.
how can you attribute that to sanctions when the COP21 conference happened just last month? That was the whole conference of hundreds of the world leaders coming together and saying, yes, we need green energy.
Right,
We
so
can't
what-
attribute that effect to sanctions. Can I ask you one more?
Actually, I have another question.
Sure.
So in your second contention about China, why would China want to partner with Russia if Russia's economy is failing?
All right, so Russia and China want to work together because, as we said with our New York Times evidence, Beijing sees Russia as a potential gold mine of raw materials, infrastructure, products, and new customers. So that's why China wants to partner with Russia.
Okay, so-
and also we can see in the status quo that this is happening, that it's not a hypothetical. Like Russia and China have already signed trade agreements and investment agreements.
So can I just, the date on that Beijing?
Yeah, that's September 2015.
Real quick, can I see the Russian military budget evidence? So we'll stop and restart, we'll start and get the evidence.
Sorry.
Do you have the card?
It's dated the second, so. I'm sorry, we don't have it actually.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, we'll take some break.
Okay, stop.
And that's 11 seconds.
Okay, just ready? Minutes? Alright. Okay. So, first, on their definition that threat is something that possibly harmful that will happen, we agree with this and we assert that in order for them to win, they need to prove that the net threat, on balance, the threat that Russia poses to Western interests is decreasing. So, on their first contention, they said sanctions made Russia seriously factor in the response from the West before invading Ukraine. Well, maybe Russia seriously considered the Western response, but the threat did not decrease. Rogan 15 shows that despite the extended sanctions, Russia refuses to give up control of 2 large Ukrainian provinces, thereby refusing to implement the Minsk II ceasefire agreement it signed, which included that all foreign military groups would exit Ukraine. So it's violating this agreement. 2, Bachelor 15 shows that just last month, Russia deployed an additional 20,000 troops to eastern Ukraine. That also is in direct violation of the treaty and signifies increased aggression. And 3, Nakashima 16 shows that barely 2 weeks ago, a Russian cyber attack blacked out the capital of Ukraine and parts of the country not controlled by Russia. So these 3 examples show you that aggression is increasing within the last few weeks and months. And then additionally, even if they win, that Russia has killed less people since the signing of the Minsk II agreements. Russia's goal in taking Ukraine is to give it a perpetual military conflict so that Ukraine can never enter NATO, which is the greatest threat to Russia because that's a military alliance against Russia. So Russia doesn't need to kill people in order to hold onto the territory because Ukraine can't join NATO if there's an ongoing military conflict. So Russian aggression is still continuing even if lives are being not taken as much. So then on the treaty convention about energy independence, they say that sanctions have caused Europe to make a serious commitment to energy independence, but their link here is completely non-existent. First, their one card that they use is from 2014, and it says that agreements have been made in the last 3 to 4 years among European countries to become energy independent. Sanctions started in March 2014. That means for at least 3 years before sanctions passed, they were still making these agreements, which means it's completely non-unique because sanctions did not cause them to make these agreements. And then, secondly, their card doesn't even mention the word sanctions at all, and it doesn't show how sanctions are causing this agreement to happen or even causing it to continue, so they have no link. And then third, sanctions didn't stop European imports of Russian natural gas. No sanction is banning Russian natural gas, it is banning oil, but Europe relies on Russia for 25% of its natural gas. And this is really important because in 2006 and 2009, Russia was able to cut off the natural gas supplies to Europe. So because Europe is not becoming independent from this natural gas because they rely on it too much, then sanctions aren't working and it's not causing them to be energy independent. In addition, there are alternate motivations to green energy. Europe doesn't need to sanction Russia in order to want to go green. There are other motivations for that, such as saving the planet. So then they talk about the Russian military, but first, the one card they talk about they can't find, so there's no evidence for that, and you drop it right away. But second, we don't care if Russia is reducing, it's slowing the rate at which it builds up its conventional military, because we show you that the nuclear threat of Russia has been increasing. So the overall, the greatest military threat that Russia can pose to Western nations is the threat of nuclear war. And to the extent that we're showing you that that increases, then we win the military threat is increasing. Additionally, turn this against my opponents because Lauren Thompson writes for Forbes that Russia's comparative disadvantage in Western conventional warfighting technology makes it more dependent on its nuclear technology for threats. So since sanctions are exacerbating this disadvantage by making it so that Russia is slower to develop its conventional military than other countries such as the United States, it forces Russia to become even more reliant on its nuclear technology, which is really bad because it causes Russia to perpetuate more threats, as we've seen with Russia and Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons to defend its interests in Ukraine, and also by following up on that threat in moving nuclear weapons to Crimea. So sanctions actually make this worse because it makes Russia more reliant. And additionally on sanctions, if we win nuclear technology, then we're completely winning all of their impacts, because even if they win that Russia is becoming less aggressive in Ukraine, if we win nuclear technology, then there is a net greater lives lost. So for all these reasons, I urge a negative ballot.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Is everyone ready? So first on the framework debate. Basically remember that today's debate is going to be about the Western interest of reducing Russian leverage in controlling all these other things. Let's go down to contention. What about nuclear threats? There's a couple problems with this. First, we're already reducing Russia's military capacity. Berman, the VP of the Foreign Policy Council, writes in 2015 that the cost to Russia of waging conflict is directly related to the price of amassing military hardware. The West can leverage this through sanctions by increasing the cost of importing military goods and thus force Russia to spend more and more, depleting their savings and making it harder for them to mobilize troops. But secondly, Dougherty of the Center for Strategic Studies in 2015 concludes that sanctions have impacted Russian military plans in two ways. First, by decreasing their public budget, adding delay to enhancing programs, and secondly, by limiting access to important military parts and supply chains. According to Kumar of the International Business Times in 2015, Russia planned to replace 30% of its military equipment. However, forced cuts to the defense budget of 5% will leave the economy struggling to pay for the nation's defense modernization program. Finally, as in the PBS in 2015 finds that Russia's military still relies on old techniques and Soviet-era hardware. For example, their terrible performance in the 2008 Georgian conflict. Now let's talk specifically about this nuclear threat, right? Their one warrant is that sanctions on Iran meant for enriched uranium to be transferred to Russia. That in itself poses no threat. That uranium can't pose any sort of threat unless they actually develop it into a nuclear weapon. And what we've just shown you is that we're reducing Russia's capability of doing that. Furthermore, Julian Cooper writes in August of 2014 that Russia's domestic machine tool industry is unable to produce advanced weaponry and can meet barely 10% of its needs. So essentially what we're doing with sanctions is reducing their capacity to use these things. They haven't actually shown an increase in nuclear weapons or anything like that. They're just saying that uranium transferred from Iran to Russia, that in itself poses no threat. They haven't clearly explained that. Finally, Business Insider reports in 2014 that Russia already has 8,000 nuclear warheads. Getting a couple more from Iran doesn't make Russia any more threatening because they already have enough to destroy the entire United States. So essentially, even if you're believing that entire argument, economic sanctions essentially have no impact on that because if Putin really wanted to engage in nuclear war, he could do so anyway. But finally, the US would, Putin's not an idiot basically. Putin would never use his nuclear weapons because of mutually assured destruction. They say over and over again that they're pushing Putin to the edge and that they're going to see this increase in nuclear war. But because the United States and all of NATO also has these nuclear weapons, that would never happen. In fact, Shilpa of Valuewalk finds that consensus among experts is that nuclear war is incredibly unlikely. They quantify it at about 2%. Remember, this 2% number is going to be very important because it's the only number that actually quantifies how much threat this poses. Remember, that threat is irregardless of economic sanctions. They don't show an increase in threat, which is what the entire negative side is trying to prove to you today. Their second contention about China, a couple of things. First, in that round of the national review put in 2014, China isn't about to join Russia in a political alliance against the West. There's no harm to the West from Russia and China trading a little bit more. But more importantly, Grady of the U.S. Naval Institute writes in 2015 that a turn to the east for economic development and to overcome sanctions is impossible. That's because right now, China's investment in the Russian economy is at about 3%. But more importantly, the Chinese are looking for the exact same things as Western investors, which are safety and profitability. Russia doesn't have that. Finally, you can turn this against them. Courtney of Reuters explains in 2015 that Russia's diminished economic prospects caused by sanctions weaken its ability to deal with China on an equal plane, dooming their relationship to be unsuccessful. So clearly we've already turned the war, but on their impacts again, it's only nuclear war. They can't show a quantifiable increase just from allying with China. Extend all the rebuttals I just made to their first contention to that one as well. Really quickly on our case, in response to our preventative measures, they keep talking about this 20,000 figures. They don't actually show what threat that actually increases. Those 20,000 troops aren't actually doing anything. So again, that's not a reason not to vote for our side for all these reasons we affirm.
Can I see the 2% card, please?
Sorry, which part?
The 2% card.
Okay.
And also, what was the date from the China card that talks about how it's imbalanced?
It's imbalanced. It's 2015, like the actual month.
Yeah, what's the month?
Yeah, sorry, let's get a sentence. Go to G. February 2015.
Do you have the 2% card?
Is it okay if my partner illustrates well? Sorry, we're really disorganized this time, but is it okay to illustrate very well?
I was going to ask about it in crossguard, but
I mean, if you're gonna ask about it cross what you can see it.
because I was going to ask like if it's a 2%. I was going to ask basically about the date.
Oh, I see.
So if you could just find the date for me.
Oh, sure. I believe it was 2015, but again, my partner asked me for it.
Okay, we can start Crossfire and then you can just give it to me afterwards. Okay. Ready? Alright, so you claim that the Russian military is spending less, right? So why does that matter to the West if we see that they're using it more?
How are they using it?
Because they're increasing aggression in Ukraine. We give you those 3 links of the 3 ways that Russia is increasing aggression in Ukraine, violating the treaty, and posing more of a threat to Ukraine since the sanctions, and within like the time period of between 2 weeks ago and a month ago. So why do we care that the Russian military is reducing its rate of growth, even though you say it's still growing, if it's in the real world what we see is that Russia is using its military much more?
Right, so it's important to remember that the effective sanction is supposed to be in the medium to long term. So sure, short term, Putin is dealing with
why
all
are
this.
the aggressive sanctions supposed to be in the medium to long term?
That's just how
Is that
economic
just like your
sanctions work
opinion?
as a foreign
Is
policy.
that your opinion?
No, that's like the general consensus.
Okay,
Sanctions
I'd like to
took
see
about
evidence on that
7
before we
years.
adopt it as the general consensus.
Okay.
Because sanctions, you know, are very temporary. Once you remove them, then you restore trade. So
Right,
I don't
the
understand why
point
they're
is
just
we
long
don't
term.
remove them.
Okay,
Anyway,
so
that
moving on,
question as well.
why does it
I get a
matter
question
if we
on
don't
that,
see that, like, can you answer my question, that why the, like, slowing of military development matters if Russia is posing more of a threat when it uses its
The
military
entire
might?
point of the affirmative side is to show how economic sanctions are reducing that threat,
Yeah, but
right?
if we show
so
you
if
that,
we're
like-
reducing the military budget, that means in the long term, you can go back to our contention about brain drain as well.
Wait, how are you, you
Reducing
didn't
your
say you're
technological-
reducing, wait, let me be clear. Are you reducing the military budget, or are you slowing the rate of growth?
I mean,
Because you said you
slowing
slowed the
of
rate
growth.
at which the military budget is increasing. So
Right,
just to be
that's
clear,
still
military
increasing.
budget is still increasing from the previous years, right?
Yeah, but
Okay.
how is that any different?
Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So how do we quantify the weight of nuclear war?
That's actually a really good question. So we understand that like nuclear war used to be like this thing that mutually assured destruction could control for because no country wanted to go to nuclear war, right?
Sure.
Okay, so specifically what we argue is that Russia sees the West taking control of Ukraine as the equivalent of the beginning of a nuclear war. Because the idea to Russian military and political leaders that the West would be able to take Ukraine and add it to NATO and put nuclear weapons in Ukraine to threaten Russia is absolutely unacceptable, which is why Russia has threatened directly to use nuclear weapons to protect
If Russia knows that nuclear war would lead to their annihilation as well,
No, that's
why would
actually
they be
false.
interested in
First of all, that's false.
Okay.
Russia knows that if it uses a nuclear weapon, it can do that as long as the West doesn't respond. So if Putin believes,
Why would the West not respond?
because this is very shaky. If Putin believes that the West will, like, for example, that America will not want to sacrifice New York City to protect several European cities, then Putin assumes that the West won't use nuclear weapons.
Where
It's
do
all
you
based on what
any way
Putin
prove
predicts.
that besides you just saying that?
We have a card that proves exactly that the West was not likely to, the West is actually not likely to, like, respond. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. It
How
doesn't
does
matter
that
if the West is
matter?
not,
That's the entire
because
point of
all that
this.
matters is what Putin believes the West will do, because that was what determines whether or not he goes nuclear war.
Right,
We
so
show
how
you
can
that
you
Putin is
tell me
being
what
more,
Putin
wait,
believes or does
wait,
not
can I just
believe?
finish my response?
Sure.
So in response to your question, like, we show you that Putin is being more pressured more by its hyper-nationalist base because of sanctions in order to go and take military action. We show you that he's made a direct threat. He's followed up on that threat by moving to nuclear weapons to Ukraine. And we show you 2 Russian military analysts that show you that nuclear weapons, use of nuclear weapons is extremely likely. And we also show you a tricky link. So if you have that 2% card, I'd like it.
Alright, so it is on my computer, so it'll take a little bit to get it.
Okay. It's alright, we won't run it back, but we want to use it this time.
Okay. That's all we have.
So there's no D.
Yeah.
Okay. You can have your card back. Alright, we're gonna start.
Everyone ready? As a brief off-time roadmap, I'm just going to be going over our three stages. Alright, so first the voting issue. Since our first speech, we've told you that the biggest impact in Iran is the threat of nuclear war. This has gone unrefuted by our opponents, and that's what you're going to be voting on first. So going on to our case, our first contention talks about how sanctions increase Russian nuclear threat. Our opponents said that Russia can't expand its military and that it won't go to war. However, they've already conceded our Allison evidence, which says that Russia has enough nuclear weapons to blow U.S. off the map and is willing to use them, which was from our Russian military doctrine evidence. Also, extend my partner's turn, which says that since sanctions are reducing Russia's ability to produce conventional weapons, they're forced to depend even more on their nuclear arsenal. Also extend our Allison evidence proving that Russian political structure could cause Putin to make uninformed decisions, meaning that mutually assured destruction won't stop Putin from starting a nuclear war. And our second contention shows that sanctions are catalyzing Russia's shift to the east. Our opponents responded to this by saying that Russia won't go to war and that China and Russia trade has decreased. However, we have two responses. First, China doesn't want to work with the U.S. because U.S. naval operations in the South China Sea. Two, the card about China-Russia relations are imbalanced. That is from February 2015. Prefer our Sherman and Tiezi card, which is from September and December of 2015, meaning that the agreements signed are current day, more relevant than theirs, proving that China and Russia are working together, which means that they link into our second contention impacts, and we gain the impact of the China-Russia war. Alright, moving on to their case. Their contention talks about how Russian aggression has decreased. However, extend my partner's turn that Russia is actually increasing in aggression. The Bachelor 15 card disproves that because Russia just sent 20,000 more troops to Ukraine last month. The Nakashima evidence also says that Russia posed cyber attacks on Ukraine just less than 2 weeks ago. And on their second contention about energy independence, we have two main responses. One, they have no link. Look at their card because it doesn't mention sanctions at all. Two, Europe tries to achieve energy independence. Russia will become more aggressive, which increases the risk of nuclear war, meaning that this turns into our offense. So either they admit they have no impact, or they link into ours. Either way, they have no offense. And the third contention was about Russia's military capabilities decreasing. However, extend our Allison evidence, which shows that Putin has deployed nuclear weapons to Crimea, proving that he is willing to go to nuclear war. And for these reasons, we urge a negative ballot.
The first reason you'll be voting for the affirmative is off of our first contention about how economic sanctions are a preventive measure. Extend our jury card, which shows you specifically that because of economic sanctions, Russia was deterred from taking further territory in Ukraine. Our opponent's only response is to saying that the Minsk agreements haven't worked, but according to Andrew Foxall of the Henry Jackson Society in December of 2015, before the Minsk agreements, 9,000 people were killed, but after the Minsk II agreements were passed in February of 2015, only 212 people have been killed. So what we see from this is that because of the Minsk agreements, and which was caused by economic sanctions, we're seeing a net decrease in violence in Ukraine. But secondly, their second response was that 20,000 troops have been sent into Russia. They can't tell you what kind of threat this is posing to Ukraine, so you can drop them right off of that. The second reason you'll be voting for the affirmative is off of their entire case about nuclear threat. Remember that all their impacts link into this. Their only offense in this is saying that the West won't respond to a Russian attack, but remember they can't provide any evidence for that, saying that Russia and Putin would still attack the West if all the NATO countries are going to respond because of mutually assured destruction. Secondly, they say that Russia already has enough nuclear material to wipe the U.S. off the map. This doesn't link into economic sanctions. Economic sanctions wouldn't impact this at all because before economic sanctions, they still had enough nuclear weapons to attack the U.S., yet they didn't. So this is clearly showing you that even if they have more nuclear weapons, they're not actually going to attack because of mutually assured destruction. And but lastly, look to our second contention about energy. You can extend all three impacts because our opponent's only response is saying that we don't have a link between economic sanctions and energy independence. But if you look specifically at the Young's card, he says that because of economic sanctions, Europe was motivated to look towards energy independence. Remember the three impacts. First of all, energy dependence undermines Europe's foreign policy. Secondly, energy independence would decrease conflict. And lastly, that if Europe was energy independent, they would have increased political power. So because the affirmative is showing you that there's a net decrease in violence, and their opponents can't prove to you that Putin would actually attack the US and other NATO countries, you should vote affirmative in today's round. And for all these reasons, we affirm.
So as the first speaking, are you ready? Alright, so as the first speaking team, can we ask the first question? Sure. Okay, so you said that there's no evidence that Putin will use nuclear weapons. What would you constitute as sufficient evidence that Putin will use nuclear weapons?
I mean, historical precedent.
Historical precedent, okay. What about an active threat for how, where, and why Putin would use nuclear weapons? Because we provide evidence to you that Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine to prevent Western countries from gaining control of Ukraine and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, the military alliance against Russia. So what more credible threat could we provide?
I mean, again, just because he's saying that he's going to use nuclear weapons, we repeated it again and again.
Okay, but what about following up on that threat by actually moving nuclear weapons to Crimea?
Okay, right, but you say yourself that before economic sanctions, Russia had nuclear capability.
Yes, and look, though, I'm really, really glad you brought that up, because our link is not that Russia now has more nuclear capabilities. Our link is that Russia is more likely to threaten and use that. Remember that the Cold War was nothing but a series of threats of nuclear weapons, yet it got us so close to the brink of destruction. So that's why we have to weigh threats as really important.
Why, like in the Cold War, right? Why didn't anyone unleash nuclear weapons?
Well, at the last minute, they decided not to, and it still got really, really close. You can read up on, like, the, what is it, the human missile
And our
crisis.
proof of burden isn't to prove that nuclear war 100% will happen. We're proving that it has increased.
But wait, do you prove your impacts will 100% happen?
Well, we've already seen that it's happening. Look to our energy contention. We already seen.
So,
Okay,
Europe is trying to become energy
are
independent.
all Western countries in Europe, are they all green now? Are they all using green energy?
What
Is that at
we're seeing
100%
is that there's-
certainty?
Because of economic sanctions, there's increased discourse about
Wait, that's a really good point, because your evidence predates economic sanctions. So if your evidence says that between 2010 and 2014, sanctions, wait, real quick, can you let me finish my question?
Sure.
Since your evidence specifically says between 2010 and 2014, European countries have gotten together to try to get energy independence, and sanctions happened in 2014, then how could sanctions have caused this?
Because the card literally says that sanctions have pushed Russia.
Okay,
back
the
into
card
society.
says that they've been working on this for years before sanctions were enacted.
But only now is the actual impetus to do this happening.
Wait,
because
wait, so if the impetus to do this is only happening now, then why did they start 4 years ago?
They didn't start.
Your card
Your
literally
card
says
literally says for
that.
the last 3 to 4 years they've been working on it. Your card is dated 2014. So wait, back to your military
You have
contention.
a question, Lisa?
Sure.
Okay. So again, going back to mutually assured destruction, why did Putin want to attack?
Okay, so
Wait.
that's the Thompson card, which is
Yeah.
basically talking about mad theory, which is saying that Putin, because he's surrounded by these advisors who don't want to contradict him, he has this distorted reality of the world. And that basically means that just because everyone else thinks that it's mutually destructive, that doesn't mean Putin thinks so. And what we're worried about is what Putin thinks. And
so
because
you
Putin
claim to know what Putin does or does not believe.
What we're specifically showing you, I think this is really important. So the Voice of America 15 card, which I cited, can I finish? Just this answer. So that the card which I cited specifically says that Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons because the idea of the West being able to incorporate Ukraine into NATO by making closer ties with it and like potentially station nuclear weapons in Ukraine is the equivalent of a nuclear war to Russia, which is why they're willing to go that far.
Alright, we'll use the rest of our card. So off-time roadmap, I'm going to go over the 2 voting issues of this round. Judges ready? Opponents? Are there? Okay. So remember that in order for the pro to affirm the resolution, they must prove that there is a net reduction in the threat that Russia is posed to Western interests. And the reason you vote con is because we've actually proven there's a net increase. The first reason is that we're winning the nuclear war argument. They're going to come up here and try to show you that there's absolutely no chance of a nuclear war happening. But remember that they've dropped our 3 separate links that specifically show how sanctions have increased the threat of a nuclear war. They only attacked our Iran link that sanctions have increased Russia's nuclear stockpile. But their fatal flaw is that they fail to refute that first, Putin is more likely to use those nuclear weapons. That is why the threat is increasing. They dropped our Altos 15 evidence that sanctions have angered the Russian hyper-nationalist political base and placed pressure on Putin towards military action. And they dropped our Lin evidence that sanctions placed on Turkey have increased tension between the 2 countries. And they dropped the evidence I brought up in rebuttal, which shows that reducing Russia's ability to use its conventional military makes it more reliant on nuclear threats. And then additionally, since Turkey is a NATO country, that makes war more likely because NATO countries are legally obligated to help others that are attacked. So their only response they extend is the mutually assured destruction prevents war. But they completely failed to respond to my partner's responses on this and how she explained that first, Putin is not surrounded by advisors that will challenge him and he lives in a distorted reality. And second, if Putin doesn't believe the West would respond, then he will use a nuclear weapon. So the whole mutually assured destruction thing doesn't fall through. They've also dropped the Keck evidence that Putin has made a direct threat to use nuclear weapons. They've dropped the evidence that this blank evidence that Putin followed up on that threat by delivering weapons to Crimea, and they've dropped our 2 Russian military analysts who both say that at the present time the probability of nuclear war has increased significantly. For all these reasons, we're winning that nukes are an existential threat, and this is the first thing you vote on because it is an existential threat, and you vote on even the slight chance of Russia increasing a nuclear weapon because it's still a chance we wouldn't want to take. The second reason you're voting for us is that we extend all of our turns on their case. For Russian aggression, we've shown you with the Rogin, Bachelor, and Nakashima cards that Russian aggression is unequivocally increasing in Ukraine. For energy independence, they dropped that their evidence predates sanctions and that it literally says nothing about sanctions causing Europe to use these agreements. And on military, they still conceded that Russia is spending more on its military each year. So everywhere you view this round, the Russian threat to Western interests is increasing. For these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
first main voting issue in today's debate is going to be about nuclear threat. We've talked about this a lot. Remember that economic sanctions at the end of the day have absolutely no bearing on the issue. Remember, we've responded to the Iran card that sanctions, their only talk about sanctions was that Iran or nuclear materials are going from Iran to Russia. Remember, that has absolutely no bearing and no increase on the threat to Russia. They keep saying that Putin has this distorted view of the world. At the end of the day, my opponents have absolutely no idea what Putin does or not believe, no matter how many cards they bring up that says this. It makes perfectly logical sense. Putin would never attack the West because, well, they say that this is the biggest impact in today's debate because it guarantees annihilation for the Western nations. That in itself guarantees annihilation for Putin as well. Simply saying over and over again that Putin doesn't or does not think that, they can't ever prove that. They never actually show a quantifiable increase that economic sanctions have on the likelihood that this happens. At the end of the day, even if you believe it's the biggest impact in today's round, the probability of this is happening is so low, and the probability that economic sanctions change that status quo is so small, you're going to be dropping that contention. The second voting issue is the current reduction in threat that is already happening. Remember, we show clearly with their contention one, and they're sending in the foxhole card that my partner brings up in summary, that there's already a decrease in the loss of people dying in the Ukrainian situation, as well as less territory being taken over by Putin. We see military budgets being cut, and at the end of the day, we're showing right now that there is a threat that's decreasing. Finally, on energy independence, this is going to be the big for the round. Remember that it's directly because of sanctions that Russia is cutting off supplies to Europe, which is providing the impetus for these change to energy independence. The three impacts of that was that right now, energy dependence on Russia undermines foreign policy, but with energy independence, this will decrease conflict and will allow Russia to respond better to or allow Europe, to respond better to Russia's aggression. That means in situations like this, when Europe is now going to be energy independent, they're going to be respond better to these situations. So at the end of the day, we're showing clear reductions that are happening right now in the threat Russia poses, whereas my opponents are only looking to the long-term and future hypothetical situations for all these reasons.
Can I see the link to energy sanctions card?
I know we're supposed to disclose that, I don't know how we wanted to go about that.
You guys want RFDs?
Yeah.
Excellent, I like to hear myself talk. Okay, so we have the result. It's a 2-1 for the affirmative.
Oh, you can go first.
Okay, so I voted for the F, and this round was so good through the rebuttal, and then it just kind of like withered before my eyes. If you're going to make a nuclear argument, it needs to be incredibly compelling, and I just didn't buy it. That it was. The idea that mutually assured destruction won't work, like you tell me Putin's irrational after that he has all these yes men, those things are true, but you need to tell me that he's not only irrational, he's like literally suicidal. And like, you need to read me like 5 cards that say he's okay with destroying his country in order for me to like buy that. Because like Iran, for example, like when, who was the president? Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. He was crazy. The Ayatollah literally said, like, it doesn't matter, like, mutually assured, he said, mutually assured destruction doesn't matter because Iran's a really big country and Israel's a really small country, so, like, it'll take fewer weapons to hit them than to hit us. Like, that's a thing that, like, the supreme leader of Iran actually said, and it's still, like, mutually assured destruction worked for that country. So, like, you need, like, I just didn't buy it, and both teams spent an incredible amount of time on it, and it just, it kind of meant nothing to me. And that meant that both teams also dropped Ukraine in the final focus, which I think is where you had your strongest impact about the troops being there and the cyber attacks. Like, the cyber attack on Ukraine is a big deal, and you, like, it was, I believe you didn't mention it, but Ukraine was just sort of not talked about nearly as much as it should have been. And so you had like some stuff for Ukraine at the end of the flow, but because you spent so much time on nuclear, when you could have been hammering like energy and the shift to the east for trade, like there are other things you could have gone for more. So I ended up giving you that, but it wasn't as strong as it could have been, especially since the NAG had no framework, and you didn't refute their framework. Well, you had some, but like you didn't refute their idea that you have Western interests. Mainly, the number one thing to consider is influence in Europe, like having influence in Eastern Europe and the EU. And so that's what I went with because it was uncontested through the round. And that meant that the energy independence became really important because like I kind of considered Ukraine to be a wash and I didn't buy nukes, so that left me the energy independence. I don't like the card that you read. I think you could find something better because the card says like they've been working on it for a long time, and then the very last sentence is like, but sanctions mean that the threats like are no longer hypothetical for Russia to cut off gas, they're now very real. Like, it's clear that it is their impetus for like continuing their change, and I sort of buy that link just because there isn't very much else on the flow for me to buy. But I think you can find something stronger because the idea of like the leverage and the chance of conflict, like those are really interesting impacts, and I haven't seen that argument made before, but I think you can strengthen your link. So overall, I thought both teams were really good. I would work on your like mutually assured destruction stuff, because like when you say that staging weapons in Ukraine is the equivalent to like a first strike, that's like equivalent to what the Cuban Missile Crisis was, and that didn't result in nuclear war. So you need to show how this situation will be different, and also that this situation is probable, because the U.S. hasn't expressed any like desire to put nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Yeah.
I voted for the con side. First of all, congratulations to both teams for making it this far. You guys are amazing, and I find being a judge and a parent of PFDers, that this is truly inspirational to see you guys. But I thought you did an effective job of dismantling their argument for the economic or the energy independence, and I thought that was your strongest effect within the debate, and that also you dominated both crossfires, and that was the main reason why I voted for you guys.
So again, congratulations to all of you for getting this far. I voted F. So I know a lot of what you had said kind of rang true with me too. It was great to start with, and there's so many different factors. Y'all were both really touching on, and then it turned into nuclear war. And I can see where you were trying to go with it, and I can agree when you say like there's just not enough, like it turned into more of a what if or a slippery slope than it did actual conclusive evidence to really like drive that home. So kind of like what you were saying, like it really lost some of its fodder in getting me to be convinced that that was really the strongest thing you could have argued. But I mean, that was really, that's essentially what got it for me. But I admire both of your dedication to, your evidence. You both provided a lot to think about. So thank you for that. As a judge, like my flow was just a mess here because there was so much going on. But in a good way. So, keep that up and just bear in mind for the future